It's episode 155 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Go visit hankgarner.com and browse through all of the archives of the show. Be sure to subscribe while you're there. Over in the right-hand sidebar, there's lots of episodes to go back and listen to. Get yourself up to speed and get some motivation for this new year. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors this week. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. My good friend Daniel Arthur Smith is the curator and the genius behind this series. The newest episode out so far is Tales from the Canyons of the Damned in Space, Volume 1. 4 authors, excellent stories, pulpy goodness with a space setting. There's another episode of Tales from the Canyons of the Damned in Space coming soon, and you won't want to miss that. Click on the link in the show notes. There's a banner there where you can pick up the whole series. If you loved reading pulp magazines and comics when you were a kid, this will definitely bring back those memories. Also, ThirdScribe.com. If you're an author and you're looking for a way to connect with readers, or maybe you're a reader and you're looking for a way to find new authors, or maybe connect with authors that you love, ThirdScribe.com is the place to do that. Go visit Rob and the folks and let them show you how readers and writers can truly come together. Also, Nick Cole brings his awesome book, Fight the Rooster, to us this week. Challenger for Best Read of the Year. Well worth a look. Amazing job, says Tim Ward, Hugo-nominated reviewer and host of the Sci-Fi Podcast. It's the story of one man's attempt to ruin his career in order to save his life. Part Catch-22, part The Player. Fight the Rooster is an eclectic, funny, and unpredictable thrill ride through life and Hollywood. Now stay tuned for this spot from Eric Totzi and his book, The Scout.
Change is inevitable. It's heading for Earth at 12,000 miles per hour, and it will land virtually undetected. For Jack McAllister, a young writer who has finally launched a career for himself, it begins tragically. His estranged father, a former NASA engineer, dies suddenly at his home in Meriwether, Indiana, leaving Jack's Alzheimer's-stricken mother a widow. But in the wake of personal heartbreak, he's confronted by an even more astonishing event: the covert landing of an alien machine in the forest just a few miles outside of town. Now Jack must unmask the true purpose of the otherworldly device that has begun a detailed environmental survey of the woods. Aided by the town's young and resilient female deputy sheriff, he soon discovers that the alien scout is only one small part of a much larger operation, and the countdown to a terrifying global catastrophe is about to take place. Drawing deeply from his father's scientific influence, Jack uncovers and ultimately finds himself an unwilling component of an alien plan set to terminate life on Earth as we know it. Crichton-esque techno-thriller with enough twists and turns to keep you turning those pages. The rural setting and the believable characters set this apart from the majority of alien invasion novels. Sci-fi365.net. The Scout by Eric Totzi, now available at Amazon.com.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have April Henry on the show. April, welcome to the show today in the horrible weather that you guys are having.
Yes, I wish I were where you are, because 78 degrees sounds way better than 9 degrees.
Yeah, well, you know, we'll trade summers with you then, and maybe that'll be better. April, I begin each interview with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I started writing when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade, and because I loved to read, and books and words and letters themselves were magic. And I wrote a short story about a 6-foot-tall frog named Herman who loved peanut butter, and I decided that Roald Dahl, the guy who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, would really like to read my story. And my dad could have said, well, that's a stupid idea. Why would he want to read your story? But instead, he showed me how in the front of a book there is the address of the publisher. And he said, why don't you try sending it to him, care of his publisher? So I sent it off to New York, and it eventually made its way over to England. And eventually he sent me back a postcard telling me how much he had liked my story and that he had read it to his secretary and his daughter. And so I was probably too young to know how amazing this was. And as I got older, I stopped writing and didn't start writing for years and years after that, because it felt impossible that someone growing up in a little logging town in Southern Oregon could ever be a writer. I wished I had taken him more seriously or realized what an amazing honor that was.
Man. Do you still have that postcard?
I do have the postcard. I just got it framed, and I kind of feel like I should almost put it in a safety deposit box. I actually had 2 postcards from him, but this was back in 1972, and I'm lucky that even one has survived. And I don't remember what the other one said. I just remember I was young enough to kind of think that we were a buddy, you know.
Oh, that's so cool. That is so cool. Would you say that you were a precocious child?
Well, in some ways, I always was a big reader. I always had a huge vocabulary. I had a vocabulary that was way outstripped anybody that I was growing up with. So I think a lot of times people didn't even really understand me, and maybe I didn't understand people that well either. So it was I was precocious in some ways and maybe not as precocious in others. So, but book-wise, reading-wise, yeah, I was precocious.
That's not an uncommon thing for writers. I think that we get these ideas when we're young that kind of haunt us through the rest of our life. At what point did you kind of pick the torch back up and say, circumstances and surroundings, aside, I do think I want to pursue this?
Well, I'm probably the only person this has ever happened to, but I got a book from the library, and I used to read all of my books all the way to the end, and it kind of had a dumb beginning. And I thought, well, reading it, it's going to get better, and it didn't. It had like a stupid, nonsensical ending, and the character did a bunch of dumb things. And I remember thinking, this book is terrible. It's really awful. And then I picked it up and saw that it had been published by one of the biggest publishers in New York. And I thought, wait a minute, this book sucks, and it got published. I could do that. I know I could do that. So I'm probably the only person that's ever been kind of negatively motivated by a book. But it inspired me, and I wrote a book, and that did not get published. I wrote a second book and a third book. Those books didn't get published. And then my 4th book sold in 2 days.
Wow. What was that book?
It was called Circles of Confusion. And it was a mystery about a woman who inherits what may not be a long-lost Vermeer painting. And it was kind of inspired by my mother's old neighbor. Had bought an unclaimed trunk from a train station. I guess they used to do that in the 50s. And they wouldn't even open them. So it was like buying a big grab bag of stuff. And inside there was a lot of art that I believe was looted in World War II. And I just found it kind of crazy that this woman living in a trailer home in Talent, Oregon, owned a little painting of Napoleon. And it had a stamp on the back that said it had belonged to the Borghese Museum. And here she was with this painting. So I didn't put that painting in the book, but I made up a Vermeer and put it in the book. But it was inspired by something that really happened.
That's awesome. Was this book a mystery?
Yeah, it was a mystery. It was like, is it real? Isn't it real? It wasn't a traditional mystery. I didn't start with a body dropped on page 1. In fact, I think only one person dies in the book, and it's pretty late. But my agent thought it would sell well as a mystery, and I was like, I want a sale. I don't care. You can call it a cookbook. I just want a sale. So she sold it as a mystery, and luckily she had brought up the idea to me that they might want a second book with the same character, because when they made that 2-book offer, I only had a few days to say what my second book would be about, and I took the idea I had been playing around with and just gave it to the character I had already written about.
How cool. You said that your agent pitched it as a mystery. What did you see it as?
I guess I just saw it as contemporary adult fiction, which is, I guess, a fairly wide genre, or not really a genre at all. But so I think it in some ways helped it stand out, that it wasn't like a traditional mystery. It wasn't like, the lady opens up the door to the unused vacation house and there's a body on the floor or something in the first 3 pages. Because that book ended up being a finalist for the Agatha and the Anthony and one other award. I went to a bunch of bad banquets in the year 2000 to see. I didn't ever win an award, but I got to eat a lot of bad food, and it's so nerve-wracking, because a lot of times they won't announce who the winners are until after dinner, so you have to eat your food while you're your stomach is churning, wondering who is it going to be.
Oh, the lesson here for you aspiring writers is to achieve success, you have to sit through a lot of bad dinners.
Yeah, or at least to get an award.
Right. Oh, man. Were you a fan of mysteries when you were growing up?
Oh, I always liked mysteries. I think that's the one genre that almost everybody reads. There's probably only a subset of people read science fiction, or a subset read romance, or a subset read historicals or westerns or whatever. But I think mysteries, that's the most popular genre in America. And I think even people who might normally not read them will still read them on vacation or if they're traveling. So I think all of us are probably fans of mysteries to some degree. What's surprising to me is how few mysteries there are for teenagers, when it is the most popular genre for adults, but there's not so many written for teenagers.
And I want to touch on that subject in just a minute, but what do you think it is that makes us love mysteries so much?
Well, in real life, most murders are just terrible and stupid. There's one here recently where this guy shot his ex-wife and then shot a cop and then shot himself. Or it's 2 people who've been drinking, there's nothing. It's just sad and depressing. Whereas we love the idea of a killer who's extremely smart in covering his tracks, and that you have to sleuth him out. Not like some guy who just got drunk and shot someone in front of the strip club. And then I think we also like the idea of justice. A lot of times in the real world, there's not much justice. So you can have the thrill of justice and of imagining yourself as the main character confronting this evil figure and then winning. That's fun, put yourself in that person's shoes. On
your website, you say, "I kill people, but only on paper." I saw that and laughed out loud. I thought that was really great. I've had several conversations on the show about writing stories that are a little dark and that kind of go to places that we as people would never go to. But as writers, we're able to tap into something that allows us to channel, something, and to maybe wrestle with issues that we would never get to wrestle with in real life. What do you think about that? That, like you said, I kill people, but only on paper, when we know you're a lovely, beautiful, caring person.
Well, that's what I want you to think anyway. I think that it's kind of a way to explore things safely. To just kind of think about those things. And I've taken the point of view of like a serial killer before. And I think in some ways, just like method acting, where people, they might have killed somebody as an actor, but they have killed a pesky fly or something, that they can take that emotion and use it as the basis of their performance, or you can use that as the basis of your writing. I think, it's a safe place to know about dark things or to think about dark things, but it's not actually happening to you. And if you get freaked out, you can close the book up and go away. Whereas if it was happening to you in real life, you wouldn't be able to do that. So it's just a safe way to imagine things and to get the vicarious, visceral thrills without actually having to go through it yourself.
That's great. It's sort of a catharsis to deal with things in our imagination that we don't get to. You were mentioning earlier that there's a great lack of like YA mysteries, and there's been huge fantasies and post-apocalyptic. We've seen the books turned into movies in the last few years, and that's taking up a lot of space in YA right now. But I first discovered you from my daughter Jessica and her friend Shelby came home, and they of course know that I do this podcast and I talk to writers, and Jessica brought me this book, Girl Stolen, and she said, "Oh my gosh, Dad, this is the best book ever, and nobody is writing stuff like this for people like me." And I said, "Oh, that's fantastic. Tell me what you think about it." And she read it in like, a day and a half, and she just handed me the book and said, "You got to read it." And I read it, and my socks were blown off. I was like, "Man, this is fantastic. This is, one of the best mysteries, yet it doesn't go all Silence of the Lambs. But it feels like it has the potential to. Like there's this great tension that you have in your writing where you write this for a broad audience, but at the same time leave things to our imagination. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe about the lack of people doing it well in YA, and how you sort of structure a book that hits that target?
Well, I think the monster in the closet behind the door is way more scarier than the monster when we see them. So I think letting people's imaginations fill in some of the blanks is actually more evocative than spelling everything out. And it was a delicate balance with that book because I was writing for teens, and this girl, it was based on a real story I saw about a girl in the Portland area who was waiting for her mom and stepdad in a car and had decided not to go with them to go Christmas shopping, and her mom left the car and a guy stole it. And she was let go after about 10 minutes, and she's blind. That was the thing that really struck me. And I thought, what if they hadn't let her go and you're blind? Like, what could you get around? What would you be able to do? So it started with a real idea. And then I thought, if someone, accidentally kidnapped her, that I should at least raise the possibility that she might be sexually assaulted. But I didn't want to go there with kids. So there's some recognition that could happen, but it doesn't happen. And then there's a time in the book where she does something that's quite dark, and she feels it's the only thing that she has to do it or she won't survive. But I've had a lot of kids or teens comment on the thing that she does. But it also, I think it was demanded by the story. It was something that she really had to do in that situation. As to why it's not necessarily that there's bad mysteries out there for teens. I just don't think there's very many. There's Carolyn Cooney writes is probably the main person that I would think of. And then there's a few others, but there's not that many mysteries for teens. I'm starting to see more. The one thing that disappoints me is I feel like they haven't done their homework. Like I was reading a book the other day where they said, the author says that you can't report somebody missing 48 hours, and that is not true at all. So I feel like if you're going to write mysteries that involve police procedurals, you can't rely on something that you saw in a movie, something you saw on TV. You need to make sure that it's accurate. So while I'm starting to see more books, I'm seeing a lot that were simply not researched. And sometimes I'm asked to blurb them, and I will pass on books that are wrong. And I've passed on a lot. I'm starting to think that if someone's going to ask me to blurb a book, they have to be willing to correct things if I find things that are wrong.
Yeah, authors, if you're going to include pertinent details in your book, don't get those details from primetime television. Make a call, find out for sure.
Well, there's a lot of great written resources for people. There's a lot of ex-cops out there that have written books for writers, or there's a doctor I know that has written a book. He's written one of those forensics for dummies. There's lots of books, and there's a group on Yahoo called Crime Scene Details for Writers, and you can go in there, you can join, and you can search their database to see if your question has already been asked. And if it hasn't, you can ask your question. And there's a lot of retired cops and FBI agents and arson investigators, people like that, who will answer your question. And so there's really no excuse for getting things wrong. I think you can find someone to help you with your answers.
And groups like that are probably a lot, and books like that are probably a lot safer than Googling how to scrub clean a murder scene.
Well, I actually still do that kind of stuff too. At least because I did a book a couple of years ago called Blood Will that involved a lot about YSDR DNA. And I had a DNA that I knew would answer my questions, but I'd go to him and say, explain DNA. I need to, and then come to him with more specific DNA get answered on the internet. But I will say that I do start with the internet a lot, but I'm not going for some chat group. I'm going for some academic paper that has been put on the internet, or something that is more official and where the people are not just, making things up.
I think you're most well known for your YA work, or at least where I have in the circles that I've been.
The last few years, that is.
Yeah, when you set out to write a book for the YA audience, do you do that purposefully, or does the story just kind of go there naturally? I guess what I'm asking is, are there particular tools that an author uses to target that audience specifically?
Well, my first YA was actually conceived as an adult book. It was called Shock Point. I had read these stories in the New York Times about these overseas boarding schools or the overseas boot camps that were being sold to American parents as a much cheaper alternative to an American boot camp. If you had a troubled teen that even for something as slight as you caught them smoking, they would say, you should send your kid to our boot camp because it's way cheaper than the ones in America. Well, there's a reason they were way cheaper, because the laws governing children in a country like Mexico or Western Samoa are much more lax. So when I wrote this book, I thought of it as an adult book that happened to feature a 16-year-old main character, similar to the book Nathan's Run features a 12-year-old and is an adult book. So when I showed it to my agent, she said, you've written a young adult book, and that was news to me. So the things that changed in it between when I wrote it and when it got published as my first young adult was that it got cut, it got shorter. I think if you are writing I realize now that I am writing for reluctant readers as well as good readers, so kids who don't normally think of themselves as readers. So that means for me that I am shooting for somewhere between 50 and 55,000 words. I mean, if you're a teenager who doesn't think they like to read, Harry Potter may just be way too intimidating. The book looks too thick. The second thing is you have to decide where you're going to go in terms of sex, in terms of violence, and in terms of language. And I have chosen to not go there very much. I just have a character say, I'll say a character swore. I don't say what they said. We all know what they said. I don't dwell on violence. And if my characters are usually not sexually active, and if they are, they don't talk about it. So those three things are the things I mean, it's weird because you don't think about this for adult books, but it happens all the time for teen books. That there is some parent who challenges it, and I've known teachers who have lost their jobs over books. So I'm not writing a book that is supposed to make you feel better about how you're bulimic or something. I'm not writing a problem novel. I'm writing a book that is entertaining and you learn some stuff along the way, but it's not meant to be a book that is speaking out for some troubled group of teens. So I decided I really didn't need to push the envelope in terms of what's acceptable in a school library. And I really would not want to have a teacher that was at risk of losing their job because a kid read my book and got it out of their classroom library, or a librarian who got in trouble because she was carrying these books. So you have to decide about that. But you know what? Other than that, I would say there's not any difference in the books that I write for adults and the books that I write for teens. I don't use a different vocabulary. I don't change around my research. I don't change around how I plot them. All of that is the same. I will say that thinking about how can I keep teens reading, teens who have so much that they could do alternatively, has helps me be a better writer for adults. It's helped me think about, can I end this chapter on a cliffhanger, or can I break my chapters up so that they're shorter? Even if they have the same amount of information, shorter chapters make you feel like the book is just galloping along. So I've taken some of those things and applied them to my adult books.
Well, and it seems like that's a good exercise. If you can say what needs to be said, and you can paint the visual picture for the reader in 55,000 words, the same way that you could in 100,000 words, how much of that is just fluff that's in there for our own ego or whatever? Not saying that books shouldn't be 100,000 words when they need to be, but use the proper language and tell the story in the most riveting, compact, economical. That's the word I was looking for. Economical way possible.
Right, and it's not like if you're writing a fantasy, maybe you need those 100,000 words to explain about the dragons or the witches or the people from outer space or something. But if you are writing a contemporary, you're setting it in a world we already know. It's not an unusual world with different things that don't even exist in this world. So I think you can get away with shorter writing and tighten things up. I love all those things Elmer Leonard said about writing, where he was talking about, cutting scenes with the weather and cutting scenes with people traveling and cutting out all the boring parts. I think that's really good advice.
One of my favorite examples of that was I heard Nicholas Sparks one time talk about when he was writing, I think it was The Notebook, and one of his characters was in World War II, I guess, and he had a book of poetry that he carried with him while he was in battle, and he said that there was this whole chapter where he talked about this book of poetry, and it just went on and on and on and about all of his travels with him, and he kept whittling that down and cutting and cutting and cutting, and he got all of that down to one sentence, and the sentence was, and I'm paraphrasing, was something about how much he loved the book, and the book even took a bullet for him one time. And where previously he had talked about being shot and the book had stopped the bullet and, all way more detail, but he summed that down to one sentence, and I thought that was a fantastic example.
Well, I heard Anthony Doerr speak recently. He's the guy that wrote All the Light We Cannot See. He's a delightful person, but he was sort of talking also about the danger of being seduced by research. So All the Light We Cannot See is set on a French island during World War II and features a blind girl and a boy who's been pressed into service by the Nazis. So he's quite young. It's at the tail end of the war. And when he was doing his research, he discovered that these Canadian troops had been parachuted into France, I think, with little bicycles strapped to their chests. And when they parachuted and landed, they immediately would assemble their bicycle and ride off. And he was so fascinated by that. And he didn't have any Canadians in his book, and there really wasn't a need for a Canadian spy on a bicycle. But he said that he spent weeks trying to work this nugget into the book before he realized that he was letting his research overtake the needs of the story. And I think that's something that lots of writers fall into, is is that you have this fascinating thing you've learned and you want to share it, but it might not fit the needs of the story.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that your books, you really scale back the violence, and you were talking sex, violence, and language, but violence especially kind of stuck out at me because some of your books are really intense and really deal with some horrible situations. How do you describe the horrific nature of some of these crimes without going all, slasher movie on it?
Well, I guess, first of all, it should never feel loving. I read a book one time by someone I had met casually, and his part of the book was told from the point of view of the killer. He would encase people in a sculpture or something and they died, or I don't know, it was kind of awful, but it really dwelled on it. So I guess it should kind of be brief. It should leave some blanks for you to fill in with your imagination. And I don't know, maybe just a few telling details rather than paragraphs and paragraphs of description of what happened. I mean, I think letting your mind fill in the details again is just one of the strongest ways. So I do have violence and I've never been challenged for violence, but I try to make it serve the story, and I try not to be like step by step about the knife, penetrating slowly or something. I don't want to have a lot of details like that.
Right. When you're writing your books, are you an outliner, or are you a pantser, or are you some hybrid of in between those?
I've probably written, I was counting it up, between books that haven't been published or books that have yet to be published. I'm close to 30 books, I think. So some of my books are more, I think Girls Stolen wasn't particularly plotted. I just knew that this girl was in trouble and she had been kidnapped, and she's in this isolated house in the woods. But I didn't really, and I knew that I wanted her to be alive at the end, but I really didn't know what was going to happen in between. And some books, I have a fairly detailed outline. Right before we started talking, I was working on a book that's due in the next 6 months or something, called The Lone Dead. And it's, I'm trying to outline that one more. I think outlining allows you to write faster. So, but I don't necessarily always outline. But I think if you have at least even a vague idea of where you're going, it helps you get there at least a little faster. You won't take so many detours. So I'm always, it's funny, I still read a lot of craft books. So I'm always, I just read this book that I thought was really useful by a woman, I can't remember her name, but the book is called Take Off Your Pants. Libby Hawker. I liked that book. I felt like it was useful and helped me think of some things that I wouldn't normally have thought of. So, and I have a huge stack of books I'm reading right now on writing, just to see it, because I feel like there's always tricks that I can learn. There's another book I like called Secrets of the Highly Prolific something, and she talks about different ways to be able to write more, because that's always kind of my goal, is to write at the minimum. I'd like to have 1,000 words at the end of the day, but I'd much rather have even more than that.
When you get an idea for a book, how long does it take for that idea to come to fruition? Like when you do you have I guess what I'm asking, do you have a set publication schedule and you have things kind of worked out? Okay, this is a series I'm working on. I'm going to put out 3 or 4 books in this series. Or do you maybe pick up the newspaper, see a story and say, this would be great, and then begin working on it? Kind of what is your process for getting stories started?
Well, I don't know if you saw today, there was a story, I just saw the headline on CNN, about a girl who was kidnapped when she was 8 days old, or 8 hours old, has just been found. DNA test proven that's the daughter.
Yeah, my wife showed me that video this morning. It's crazy.
immediately I was like, well, couldn't that be a story? You know, like, why was she taken and what? And but then you would have to think of, I think what the sticking point would be how do you make it exciting now? It's not just this. If you want to, I could see you could do a book that was about, they said this girl's over 18 now, so she can decide whether she wants to meet her birth parents. But would you, I mean, that would be maybe more of a domestic drama rather than someone who's being chased and in fear for her life. But I could easily see someone is going to turn that into a book. So with like the book that came out in May of 2016, The Girl I Used to Be, I had seen a story in our local paper about how 30 years ago, a family had gone out looking for a Christmas tree and then never came back. And it was a dad who weren't married to each other and they actually fought a lot. And she actually had a restraining order on him. But families are complicated. And he had called her up and said, why don't we take our kid out and go look for a Christmas tree, which is something people do in Oregon and Washington a lot. And so when they had disappeared, around the same time, they had found a 3-year-old at a Kmart like 90 miles away, and they didn't even realize it was their daughter. And when they did, she was so young she couldn't tell people her name. She couldn't say what had happened to her parents. They eventually found the mother's body, and she had been stabbed to death. And they figured that they must have had one last terrible fight, and he had dropped their daughter off at the Kmart and taken off. And then when I read the story in the paper, it said they had found one of his bones area where 30 years later that the both of them had been killed by someone else. And it was the killer who took their kid to the Kmart, probably was too young to say what happened. So with a book like that, I thought about the idea for maybe 2 years, and it was I don't know about you, but I usually have an affair book. I usually have a cheater that I'm not supposed to be working on, and every now and then I do. And it was my affair book for a long time. And then eventually it became my main book. And I finished it. But there was probably 3-4 years where it was something I worked on and off, and I might try and think of twists and turns, but it definitely wasn't my main priority. So sometimes I'll get an idea and it will just immediately flow through. I just in July met with my editor and showed her like 15 different ideas I had for books, and we talked about them. So all of those were more just along the lines of 1 or 2 sentences. They weren't very fleshed out, but I wanted to know what she was most interested in so that I could start focusing on that. And then I usually am writing at least 1 book a year and sometimes 2.
Awesome. Tell me about what it takes to do a good cross-collar choke.
Oh, I love a cross-collar choke. Well, I was just doing one last night. I found a friend of mine's boyfriend likes to drive in the snow, so there was only 4 of us grappling last night. You need to you take your right hand if you're right-handed, and you would reach across over the person's neck, and you would go as far back as you could. Ideally, you would want your fingers to be touching the label of their coat or their sweater or whatever, with your thumb up and outside of that, and your fingers inside their clothing. Your left hand then would cross over your right hand, and some people will put their hand inside to choke, but it's difficult sometimes to get your fingers in there. You can just grab top of their jacket, whatever, and you turn your wrist so that your radius bones are pressing into their carotid arteries. And obviously, when you're doing this recreationally, people will tap as soon as they feel that pressure. If you are not doing it recreationally, if you are doing it because you had to, you have about 10 seconds, maybe at the most 30 before they would pass out.
Of course, we're talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You are a lover of Jiu-Jitsu. You can look at your webpage and tell that you are all in. Have you included any of the things you've learned in Jiu-Jitsu in any of your books?
Yeah, the next book that's coming out called Count All Her Bones, it's the same character as from Girls Stolen as Cheyenne. And it's 6 months after that last book, and her dad has hired a bodyguard for her who also knows jiu-jitsu as other self-defense. And so she has taught Cheyenne jiu-jitsu. Now, it might seem kind of a stretch to think of a blind person being good at Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but there actually is a guy who's a TED speaker who is not only blind, but actually is missing most of his fingers because when he was a teenager, he was holding a firecracker and it blew off his fingers and blinded him. But anyway, my character now is quite good in jiu-jitsu, and so she uses an arm bar at one point, and they're actually choke in the book and at the very end of the book. So, so I use jiu-jitsu in it, and I use some martial arts in The Girl that was a book, I think a 2011 or 2012 book. I was taking Kachikembo at the time, but all martial arts have a lot of things in common. So the things that she does in there could be used by probably would appear in almost any martial art.
That's awesome. You also do a lot of school visits. How important is that to you, and what do you get from interacting with your readers like that?
Oh, it's amazing and sort of, I don't know, weird. I mean, lately I will meet kids who burst into tears when they meet me, and you want to look around and see who it is they're looking for. Or, some 16-year-old girl who's shaking so badly that you can see it, that she is trembling so violently to be in your presence. And I'm just me, and I'm not that special. But to talk to teens who say that they didn't like to read in my books, and I get a lot of letters from teens who say that now they read a lot because that book was the gateway drug for them. So I get to see a lot of the country, which is really interesting to be any place from, some town of 400 people in Nebraska to Washington, D.C., and everything in between. And I just like the energy of teens. Adults are the same. If they like you or don't like you, they are going to applaud with a smile on their face. And it might not even look that much different which way they feel about you. If teens are bored, you know it. So it really keeps you on your toes. If you're talking to an auditorium of 500 kids, you will know whether they are interested or not. And you can kind of have a panic attack about that sometimes, because if you get the one disruptive kid, and I've never been a teacher, you don't know whether you should just stop and stare at them or whether that is going to inspire them to do even more annoying things. But I would say 99.9 kids are just amazing, and I can tell they're excited about books. I get letters from teachers probably every week saying that me having been there or just my books have inspired their kids to read. So that to me is my real purpose in life. I love to read. If I can make one more person love to read, then I've done my job for this life.
I'm sure you do question and answer sessions with your visits, but what do you begin talking about with the kids? What do you bring to them to hopefully inspire them?
Well, I tell them that I quit my day job to become a killer and a thief, because that's what I do. I kill people and I steal things. I steal ideas from real life. And then I'll usually start with an anecdote about a few years ago, I was really on a major deadline, and instead of writing like I should have been, I Googled my grandmother's name, which you should totally do, or your great-grandparents, because it turned out that my grandmother's boyfriend had been killed by her father for kissing her. He shot this boy for kissing her. And I was like, oh my gosh, I am the great-granddaughter of a killer, and I'm a mystery writer. That was so weird. And then also I think about her a lot, because it explains why she grew up to be by the time I knew her, she was a bitter, mean old woman. And I think I would have been bitter and mean too if my dad killed the guy that I intended on marrying for kissing me. So, and then I will talk about writing. I'll talk about where to get ideas, what to do with an idea. I'll talk about research. I'll talk about stealing from yourself. I mean, why I think a lot of times beginning writers are like, I should set the book someplace exotic that I've never been and that I will get all the details wrong on. So I talk about, there's a lot of times it is good to write what you know, or write what you want to find out, what you love, those things. So, and then I usually throw in a safety message too, because many of my books are based on something bad that happened in real life. And a lot of times it was people not paying attention to what was going on around them, or paying attention to their gut feeling that someone was creepy.
Right. Do you have any school visits scheduled for the near future?
Oh, almost too many. I'm going to a book festival in Texas at the end of this month. I also have a school visit here in Portland, and in February I have a school visit in Portland. And then in March is when it all just starts going crazy. Like, I'm going to be in Arkansas. I'm going to be in Nebraska. I'm going to be in Texas again. I'm going to be in Washington State. I'm going to be in California, New Jersey. I think I'm going to be in like 15 states or something the last part of the school year for this year. So it gets to the point where you're in a hallway with your hotel key and you don't remember the number at all of your room. And now they're just the plastic cards and they don't have a number on them. So I have been down to the desk many times. And then I also tend to think, like, a lot of times those card keys, because they're magnetic, get demagnetized pretty easily if they're by your phone or your iPad or whatever. So you'll be trying to get in your door and you're not even certain if it's your door anymore, but it won't open. And, if you look innocuous the way I do, it is pretty easy to go down with your key and get a new one with no questions asked. They don't verify that you are you. And I've been thinking about how I need to have somebody who's a killer that looks like me, because I could so easily get into people's hotel rooms. If I just had a discarded key that didn't work, I could use that to talk myself into a new key for someone else's room.
You heard it here, folks. If you ever walk into your hotel room and see April Henry sitting there, this is why. April, your newest book is called The Girl I Used to Be, and you said that the sequel to Girl Stolen is coming out this spring. When can we expect that?
Right. It's coming out May 2nd. It's called Count All Her Bones. The title was taken from I was listening to National Public Radio, and they had a haiku or a poetry contest, and the first line of one was Count All of My Bones, and I thought that would make a good title for a book. So I played around with it a little bit, and it became Count All Her Bones, but I got permission from the woman who wrote the poem, and so that's going to be at the beginning of the book.
That's incredible. I can't wait to get it. I know that our household will buy a copy as soon as it comes out. April, thank you so much for taking time out of this blustery day to come on the show. And I hope you guys thaw out soon. Where can people find you on the web to follow your work? And if they've been intrigued by this conversation, where can they go pick up your back catalog?
It's my website is aprilhenrymysteries.com, and you could go to any bookstore, and as everybody knows, you can, if a book is not on the shelf, you can ask the bookseller to order it for you and they'll get it in for you. Or of course you could buy it online. So it should be, or the libraries are always a great choice for those of us whose eyes are bigger than our wallet and need to have some books that we didn't pay for. So much recommend that over pirated copies. So those are, I know my books are especially well represented in libraries. So any of those will be good options.
That's fantastic. April, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
All right. Thank you. You have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. Join me each Tuesday and Friday at hankgarner.com for a new episode. Thanks for listening.